Hi, you guys. Let's get started on example 7. So again, we're solving for x. We're finding the roots, the x-intercepts, the zeros are the solutions for a quadratic by completing the square. Remember, we're going to force this left-hand side to be a perfect square trinomial, whether or not it wants to be. And then after that, we'll be able to solve by using the square root property and square rooting both sides. So let's get started. So remember, you guys, the very first thing we need to do before we can complete the square is we need all the x's on one side and all the terms without the x's on the other side. Okay, so the x's and the terms without x's are not getting along and they're going to be separated for a little bit. Okay, so if you see here, I spot a term that does not have an x on the left-hand side, which means I need to move this term to the right-hand side of my equation, and then on the right-hand side of my equation, I spot a term that contains an x in it, which means it needs to move to the left-hand side of my equation. So that's the first step. Okay, so I'm going to move my -10 to the right-hand side of my equation, which the way that you move -10 to the other side is by adding it on both sides of the equation, which if you guys see here, there's nothing to add the 10 to on my right-hand side. None of my terms have a term without an x in it, so I'm just going to add 10 onto this side. Okay, so -10 plus 10 will cancel and turn to 0. So I'm left with 4x squared. Let's see here, plus 4x, or hold on. Actually, before I do this, sorry guys, don't do that. The demon cats are getting me again. Okay, I moved the -10 over to the right-hand side, but silly Miss Long forgot to move the 2x squared to the left-hand side of the equation. Okay, so now I need to move the 2x squared over to the left-hand side of the equation. So I'm going to subtract that on both sides of the equation, which 2x squared minus 2x squared will cancel and turn to 0. Now, which term can I subtract my 2x squared from? The 4x squared or the 4x? Well, I have to subtract it to its like term, which the only term that has a squared in it is the 4x squared. So I'm going to subtract it to the 4x squared. So 4x squared minus 2x squared is 2x squared. Okay, so now what I'm left with, sorry about that, you guys. Now what I'm left with is 2x squared plus 4x, so plus 4x. And that will equal the 10 that's on this side. So equals a positive 10. I don't have to put plus 10. I can just write 10 since, you know, when you don't put a sign in front of it, it means it's positive. So I don't have to put the plus 10 because the plus 10 means it's positive 10. And I can just write positive 10 as a normal 10. Okay, so now our goal, we're going to force this side of our equation to become a perfect square trinomial. We're going to be mean. But before we can do that, remember, we have to check to make sure our A is 1. If our A is not 1, then we have to deal with it. Which, looking here, what is the A value? Oh no, A is 2, which means A is not 1. Okay, so when A is not 1, we're also going to be mean, and we're going to force the A value to be a 1, whether or not it wants to be a 1. So I'm going to do something to this term to make it be a 1 in front of the x squared. Okay, now, what can you divide to a 2 to make it a 1? Well, if you divide anything by itself, it equals a 1. So if your A value is ever not a 1, we're going to divide that term by whatever the A value is to force it to be a 1. Okay, which I'm going to erase this for right now just because it's getting in the way. Okay, so I'm going to divide this term by a 2 because 2 divided by 2 is 1. Now, remember I told you guys we got to keep the equation balanced. You can't just do something to one term because if you do that, then your equation is no longer balanced. Okay, so if you do something to one term, you got to do it to every term to keep this equation balanced. So if I divide 2 to my first term, I have to divide it to every single term. Okay, so what I'm left with now is 2 divided by 2 will cancel and turn to 1. So this will be a 1x squared, or just x squared, whatever floats your boat. So now a is 1. Yes. So now I'm good to go. Okay, and then 4 divided by 2 is 2x, so it's going to be plus 2x. And this will equal 10 divided by 2, which is 5. Okay, so if your a value is ever not 1, you have to divide every single term by the a value, and that will force a to be 1. Okay, so now I will make this side of my equation a perfect square trinomial by using our nifty formula, that b over 2 squared. Okay, which my b term is 2. Okay, so this is going to be 2 over 2 squared. So 2 over 2. Okay, and 2 over 2, well, anything divided by itself is 1. So this will be 1 squared, and 1 times 1 is 1. Look at that. Okay, so this is the number that I'm going to add onto this side of my equation, onto my quadratic, to force it to be a perfect square trinomial. And I'm actually going to add it to this version of the equation because that is when a is 1. But don't forget, we got to keep the equation balanced. So when I add it on one side of my equation, I'm going to also add it to the other side. So now we're starting from when the equation has a equaling 1. So as of right now, I'm not looking at this anymore. Okay, so currently I have x squared and then plus 2x. And that will equal 5. And the number that's getting added onto both sides to make this side be a perfect square trinomial is the 1. So I'm going to add the 1 on this side as well as this side. So you got to add it on both sides of the equation. Okay, it's very important. Okay, so now let's rewrite this side as a perfect square trinomial. I'm already excited. Okay, so I'm going to bring this up here. Okay, which don't forget, the shortcut for writing this as a perfect square trinomial is to square root the first term and the last term, and then we're going to take the sign of the middle term. Okay, so we're going to square root the first term. We're going to square root the last term, or the third term. And then we're going to take the sign of the middle term. Okay, so my first term is x squared, and my third term is 1. Okay, which the square root of x squared is x. And then the square root of 1, what times what gives you 1? Exactly, 1 times 1 is 1, so you're going to get 1. Okay, so now I can rewrite this side as, I'm going to put the x and the 1 in my parenthesis with the squared. Okay, and then I'm going to take the sign of my middle term, which is a positive, so plus. Okay, and then on this side we have 5 plus 1, which 5 plus 1 is 6. Look at that. Now I have a binomial squared, and guess what? The way that we cancel out a square to get rid of a squared is by square rooting. That is the inverse of a squared. All right, let's solve this thing for x. Okay, so I'm going to square root both sides of the equation. Okay, which the square root and the squared will cancel out. So I'm left with x plus 1 equals, now, don't forget, when you square root both sides of an equation, what will appear on my right-hand side of the equation? You guys are too cool for school. It would be a plus or minus. Now, the square root of 6, can you square root 6? Are there two of the same number that will multiply to be 6? Well, the only things that multiply to be 6 is 1 and 6, or 2 and 3. Okay, and even if we try to do a factor tree, you guys, if you see here, 2 and 3 are my only numbers, so I don't have any pairs. So this radical cannot simplify down. So I'm just going to leave it as the square root of 6. Okay, and then from here, we just solve for x. So I need to bring the positive 1 to the other side, which the way I'm going to do that is by subtracting it on both sides. Okay, which 1 minus 1 will cancel and turn to 0. Okay, now remember on this side, the plus or minus is going to stay with the root 6, and I'm going to put the negative 1 in front of it. So I have x equals negative 1, I'm going to write that first, and then plus or minus root 6. Okay, which currently I can't add or subtract those together because they are not like terms. Okay, you can't add a number without a square root to a number with a square root. It doesn't work out. And that's also in the Demon Cats game. So watch out. Okay, so you could leave your answer like this. Sometimes people leave their answer like that. Or you could say x equals -1 plus root 6. Or x equals -1 minus root 6. And I can't simplify any further. So guess what, you guys? That's all, folks.